It's March 6th, 2019. I'm Amy Harrington, and I'm honored to be here with Dean Hargrove for the Interviews and Oral History of Television and the Writers Guild Foundation in Brentwood, California. So we want to take a few minutes to start with some background information. So what was your name at birth?
It's the same as it is now. It's Morris Dean Hargrove, Jr. My father was obviously Morris Dean Hargrove. I always hated the name Morris, but it was a British family, and there was a long period of time when the British refused to pronounce French words except to anglicize them. I mean, a fillet was a fillet, you know. So that was my name.
And where and when were you born?
I was born on July 27th, 1938, in a hospital between Iola, Kansas, and Gas City, Kansas.
And did you grow up there as well?
Well, in a lot of different places. My father had different jobs. For a long time, he was a traveling salesman, which is a breed that no longer exists. But I lived in Iola, I lived in Gas City, we lived in Dodge City, we lived in Liberal, Kansas, I lived in Casper, Wyoming, all for brief periods of time. My home was always in Iola, Kansas, which was, and still is, a rural community, although at the turn of the 20th century they discovered gas, and it became sort of a boom town for a while until they literally ran out of gas. And they didn't have the technology in those days to induce it out, so the town sort of went into stasis, and it didn't grow anymore, and it's just sort of been getting a little smaller every year. It was a very beautiful little town, unlike most Midwestern towns that you see there, which are just a street with a couple of stoplights. This was like the Music Man. It had a town square with a 3-story courthouse with a clock that you could see from any direction you were coming into town. It had a band shell and band concerts on Thursday nights and a Civil War cannon. All of the streets were canopied with Dutch elms, and it was a really very pretty town. I had one time I thought that, well, maybe it's just my childhood memory, but then I saw some pictures of it, and it was really rather lovely and a nice place to be a kid. Unfortunately, some years ago, they had a Dutch elm blight, and all the Dutch elms died, and so now it's just kind of a town that's kind of going away piece by piece.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about your parents. Tell me more about your dad and about your mom. What were they like?
Well, they were very disparate people. My father's family, which goes back to Arkansas, were basically, that family tree are like hillbillies almost, because his father was brought up in a logging camp in Arkansas. His parents had passed away, and he was illiterate, but he met a cousin who taught him how to read and write. She was a school teacher, and they ran off and got married in Texas. Family didn't like that, went off and got them, brought them back. Then they ran off again, and they said, well, to hell with it, let them go. So they were very similar. My paternal grandfather was the janitor at the school that I went to in Gas City, which was a big 4-story condemned building that only had about 40 students in it altogether. My mother's family were much better educated. My grandfather and his 2 sisters were Phi Beta Kappa. He could read and write in several languages. Their house was a trove of literature and music, and it was quite a separation between the two. My father was a big, good-looking guy, very hail fellow, well met. My mother was a very, very smart woman and very lovely, and they made a couple and had 2 children, myself and later my brother.
What traits do you think you inherited from your parents?
Well, I think from my father, I like to think I inherited a sense of humor. From my mother, some determination. She was a stage mother to some extent, which is hard to do when you're in Iola, Kansas, because there aren't many stages. But she was a very exceptional woman. She was very smart. If today she was here and in her prime, she'd be an executive at a company somewhere. I went back to a fraternity reunion at Wichita State University, which was my alma mater, and there were some guys there who remember when she was the executive secretary to the head of the political science department. And she'd helped so many of them, and they all came up to me and remembered her fondly and had stories to tell about her, and it pleased me a great deal. So I've set up a small scholarship in her name in the political science department back there. But she was really an extraordinary woman. When she died, rather young, at 56, she was the head of the Nebraska Tuberculosis Association. So she was highly skilled and very intelligent and a lovely person.
Wow. So what were your interests growing up?
Getting out of Iola, Kansas. No, Iola was, as they said, baseball was good to be. No, I had a good time there as a kid. It was a great place to be a kid. It's a very innocent kind of environment, and didn't have any of the downsides of living in a city. I didn't have many upsides either, except they had movie theaters. And this little town had 4 theaters, including a drive-in. And I spent most of my time going to movies. I even worked at the drive-in theater when I was 13. And I loved movies because the life in movies seemed so much more interesting than the one I was living. So I had a great desire to get into that. And when I went to university, I worked on varsity shows and things like that, and got involved, and I made some short films, and then came to UCLA Graduate School as a film student, and I was there for about a semester, and then I dropped out.
So did you write when you were a kid? Was that an interest of yours?
Not really. I was interested in movies. I couldn't get enough. And back in that particular time, there was no coaxial cable, which kind of united the country from a television standpoint. So my mother, who always wanted to have the newest of everything, got us a television set, which was a rarity. We were living in Gas City at the time, which was 120 people, and just like that, they didn't have much of anything there. They had a couple of filling stations and a market. In fact, someone published a book a few years ago that I got a copy of, where they talked about sort of roadside places that had restaurants. And the name of the book was called Passing Gas, which was our town. The state took away, it was called Gas City for many years, but after a while they realized it doesn't really qualify as a city anymore, so they took the word city off the title. So now the town is just called Gas.
Really?
Yeah.
So when you got that television, what shows did you watch?
Well, it was very hard to watch television because we didn't have the coaxial cable. We had an aerial that went up, it seemed like several stories at the top of this little house we had in the country. And because we were situated between Oklahoma City and Kansas City, we would sometimes get the sound from Kansas City and a picture from Oklahoma City. So you'd be watching a drama and listening to the track from a wrestling match. So occasionally, if you got really lucky, you could see a dramatic show that had not so much snow that you couldn't actually make out what was going on. So it took a while. I mean, we were, avid watchers, and particularly as a kid, there were all these great shows. But mostly I listened to radio. And so I'm somewhat current on the radio shows of the 40s, which were what kids listened to in those days because television was such a rarity.
And what radio shows did you like?
Well, The Lone Ranger, Sky King, all these sort of adventure shows. And comedies. I love comedies. I always wanted to be a comedy writer, and so I listened to those, and comedy was very popular then. My favorite comic was Jack Benny, someone you probably never heard of.
I know Jack Benny.
Jack Benny was a master, and he also had the best written shows and treated his writers better than anybody else. Comics in those days resented their writers because they liked for their audience to think that they just made all this stuff up that they were saying. So there were various degrees of hostility. Bob Hope was famous for treating his writers badly. As a matter of fact, the mythology about that was that he had this house in Toluca Lake, but had sort of a balcony inside, and on Fridays when the writers were to get paid, he'd stand up there and throw them their checks. And he'd put them on 40-week contracts, knowing that they couldn't do anything the other 12 weeks because they were gag writers, which is a breed that doesn't exist anymore. And he was notoriously cheap. At one point, there was a person who diagnosed him as needing a doctor. I'm sorry. I'm going to start that over. If I may. Is that okay if I do that occasionally?
Absolutely.
Okay. When Bob Hope was at his prime, he developed an eye affliction which required him to get a replacement cornea. And 5 people wrote in offering to give their eye to Bob Hope. And as one of his writers said, he'll take all 5. So that was kind of very typical of the attitude of comics towards writers, with the exception of Benny, who was always a gentleman and whom the writers loved, like that.
And you worked on the Bob Hope show, right? You worked on one episode?
Well, not exactly. What happened was, I mean, I wanted to be a comedy writer to begin with. And I'd written a script, and a friend of mine said, you know, this could make a Bob Hope movie. And I said, okay. Bob Hope movies at that time were sort of sinking in their popularity. And so his producer gave him the script as he was getting on a plane, and Hope got off the other end of the plane and said, let's buy it and do it. Well, this was a thrill for me. It's a motion picture, it's Bob Hope, and I wasn't smart enough to realize that his career doing movies was pretty much over. They then offered me a job, the Bob Hope people, to come in and rewrite a movie called I'll Take Sweden with, I think, Elke Sommer. And I read the script, and I'm 22 or 3, something like that. And to get a movie credit on a Bob Hope movie to me sounded like something near the end of the world. And then I read the script. And the script, even as dumb as I was at that time, I realized this is not salvageable. There's nothing to do. And the director-producer, a guy named Freddie DeCordova, who went on to produce The Tonight Show, you know, he said, you're going to come in and you'll be beside me and we'll be rewriting all the time we're doing the movie. And then I had to pass. So that was the end of my Bob Hope experience, except that he took the script and brought in a guy who used to produce I Love Lucy. I don't remember his name, but he was a famous guy at the time. He was going to rewrite it and direct it. So he rewrote it and directed it, and it was pretty awful. And it went on television, but fortunately, I thought this was going to ruin my career. But as near as I could tell, no one ever saw it, because no one ever commented on it one way or another. So I was happy that it was kind of over and done with.
That's great. So you mentioned that, you know, where you went to college and that you went to UCLA for a year. What did you do after UCLA?
Well, I went to work on the Newhart show. Someone that I knew at UCLA was friendly with one of the 2 writers of a show called Make Room for Daddy with Danny Thomas, which was a very funny show, and arranged for me to go and meet this writer to get some kind of advice or direction or something. So I go over to his house, and he's chatting with me, and he said, well, what have you written? I said, well, I haven't written anything. He said, well, why don't you write something? Well, this was a revelation. So I went home on the weekend and I wrote some sketch material. And I took it back to him the first of the next week, and he read it. And it was an interesting experience because of my inexperience. I mean, he's looking at these papers and he'll say, that's funny. That's funny. That's not so funny. That's funny. Never smiles, right? And when he finished, he said, you know, this is what passes for very good in Hollywood. Now I left and all I heard was very good. So I'm leaving there feeling, and the more I thought about it, I said, this is a very odd compliment. It passes for very good in Hollywood. But anyway, I went to pursue it anyway. I freelanced some premises in to the Bob Newhart show, the one that nobody has ever heard about, which was in 1961, which was Bob coming out of Chicago where he did stand-up. And the show was he'd come on and he'd open in one and he'd do a phone call. Somebody on the other end of the line is in trouble, or the submarine mutiny. A lot of these classic routines, or Abe Lincoln, you know, and the introduction of Tobacco by Sir Walter Raleigh. They were classic pieces. And a guy, which they didn't do at that time because most comedy were sitcoms, you know, family comedies and things like that, took his act. And in those days, nobody had ever done that before. So took his act and formatted it into a half-hour show where he would open in one, then there'd be a girl singer, and then there'd be a sketch. And I freelanced ideas in, and they bought some of them, so I was sort of standing on the outside. The guy who was the producer had a fight with Newhart and his manager and quit the show and took all his premises with him. And so the guy who came in as a producer hired me because they're now a little bit short-handed, and I went to work on the show. And that was my first major credit, and the one I was most excited about at the time, because, you know, Newhart was a very hip new comic, and it was a new sort of comic form for television. And we won the Peabody and the Emmy, and was canceled all in about 10 days. Because in those days, when a sponsor would sponsor an entire show, you know, Bonanza was sponsored by Chevrolet. This was sponsored by Seal Test. But there was all of this commotion inside the show and infighting that Seal Test said, you know, it's not getting great numbers, who needs it? And it went away. Bob then stayed on to have, I think, 3 or 4 more successful series. And he was a very nice man and a lot of fun to work with.
Was he very involved in the writing?
Well, that was a series, that was a point of some contention with the writers, because you know, there was a staff of writers there who did. He added a certain amount to the show, but the bulk of the writing really came from the writing staff. And there was some resentment on the part of some writers that he was getting a writing credit on the show. I think in a certain way he deserved that because of what he brought to the material and certain additions he would make and attitudes that he would shift from the written material to what he was actually presenting. But when we were nominated for the Emmy, one of the writers who'd been fired, and a lot of writers got fired off of this show. I managed to stay because I don't think they knew what they would do with me anyway. So we're nominated, the writers, and this one writer who took great umbrage at his doing that, and the word came on the show that if we won the writing award, that Newhart wanted to go and pick it up. Well, this guy went crazy about this and took out a piece in Variety saying, if Newhart goes to pick up the award, I'm going to take it away from him. Now, I'm sitting at a table with him and no one else. All the other place cards for people who've been fired. The rest of the guys have their own table. Because I was always called, I used to add, the kid. So I'm sitting there, I'm saying, well, if we win the writing award, this is kind of a big guy. I've got to stop him somehow. What am I going to do? When we lost to the Carol Burnett writers, I was actually relieved. I was happy we won the show, but that was the end of that, you know. And then because I had this professional credit now, I started getting interviews with different people. I got a bunch of very strange kind of jobs. Leo McCarey, famous Academy Award comedy director from the 40s, hired me to come in and work with him on a new idea for a film. And the new idea for the film was that someone invents a new sin. Now, I never quite understood this idea, but it's Leo McCarey, right? And I'm hired on. And when I first met him, he had a big office at Fox with a grand piano because his secret desire was to be a songwriter. And he wrote the lyrics to the Cary Grant movie. I can't think of the name of it at the moment. Anyway, he got an Academy Award for that. And that was his real love. That's what he wanted to do. He made a deal with my agent for very little money. I was very inexpensive. And he brings me in, and we'd sit there. He was not in great health. He'd been a severe alcoholic throughout his life, which is no secret. And now he's in a small office with a small piano since I've been hired. And I found out later that Richard Zanuck, who ran the studio at that time, McCarey had great resentments because, you know, as far as he was concerned, he was the kid who dropped the papers off in the morning. And he resented the fact, and they didn't really want him because they felt, you know, he was past it. So Leo was sitting there, and I found out later that he was paying me out of his own pocket, that the studio didn't want to sanction this project at all. So I'd come in the morning, and then he'd tell me some anecdotal material, which was interesting. Then he said, I want you to hear this new song. And he says, Andy Williams is going to record it. Remember, this is 1960-something. And he plays the song, and the lyric was, we said goodbye on the Isle of Malachi, vowing never to return. Now, I couldn't bring myself to tell him that Malachi is a leper colony in those days. So I knew this wasn't really going to go very far. And we went to lunch once, and we'd spend time like that. Then we'd go to lunch, then we'd come back and he'd take a nap. Once we went to lunch, there was a guy named Harry Stradling, who was a famous PR guy in those days. and we're having lunch, and he says, Leo, so what are you doing? He said, well, we're doing this picture, and we're going to get Alec Guinness to do it. And then he goes up to go to the bathroom. This is one of my Hollywood lessons. And Stradley looked at him and walking away, and he said, who does he think he's kidding? My other Hollywood lesson was that I was hired. I get these random jobs. I never understood why they hired me because I didn't really know what I was doing. And my credits were kind of thin, but I guess I was just sort of inexpensive, and what's the harm? There was a fellow who'd done rewrites. He wrote Ride the High Country and some Peck and Paw movies, and they gave him a producing and directing deal. He hires me to come in to work on a show about a guy who marries a witch. And we're working on this. He's a very experienced and very good writer. And I'm just sort of like a stenographer because my ideas are kind of lame, and I'm just sort of following along and trying to thread it together. And I got a call from the Writers Guild saying that I better finish because if I stay a day longer, I'll be working for less than scale. So they said, well, why don't you just wrap it up today, and then we'll look at it and tell you about it on Monday. So on Monday, I show up to go back to work, and his assistant says, they were called secretaries in those days. The assistant says, well, he's not in today. He said, but he wanted me to tell you that the studio has stopped the project and you're no longer on the payroll. I said, oh, and in the Thalberg building, which was the big, they had a long hallway in which they had small offices for writers. Occasionally, there'd be an office for a secretary. And I had my meager belongings in this office. And so she said to me, your stuff is in the basement, I'll get security. So a security guy comes up and he takes me down to the basement, which looks like an evidence lockup room behind a screen wire. And there's all my stuff in a cardboard box. And that was goodbye. So I remember taking that box and walking out the front saying, well, this is Hollywood. So those were a couple of my major lessons that I learned. And I got a couple of other things where there was a guy named David Swift who was a very important director, writer, and he'd sold a show called Camp Runamuck, which was basically going to be like cartoons. He'd hired cartoonists to come in and do sight gags, and he wanted a couple of cheap writers to come in and do the interstitial material. So I go in to meet him, and he hires me along with this other fellow who didn't have much experience. And he said, you guys going to write the script? Here's the story idea. So we leave, and I say to my collaborator, I said, I've never collaborated. Do you have any idea how to do this? And he says, well, I don't know. Why don't you write a draft? I'll look at it, then I'll come in if I have any changes. So I went off and I wrote a draft. And he looked at it and he says, well, it looks good to me. Let's turn it into David. We turned it into David. My agent gets a phone call saying, this is the worst thing he's ever written. He says, if this goes on television, this is going to be the biggest piece of cow manure that anybody's ever going to have to look at. I took offense at this. Now, Joe didn't because he didn't have anything to do with the script. So I get called in. We both get called in to see David. He said, I realized I was a little harsh in my reaction to the script. And I'm fairly surly at this point. And I said, yeah. And he said, let me tell you the way I think this should go. And he starts talking, and Joe's making notes, and I'm listening there with my arms folded. And we leave the office, and Joe says, I see what he wants. I said, well, I hope you do. I don't have a clue, what this is supposed to be. So it's your turn. You write a draft. So he wrote a draft, goes into David Swift. I read it. I said, I guess this is what he wants. It goes in, and David Swift calls me up to his office. For some odd reason, I was sort of like the senior writer of these two lame entities that he had. And he said, listen, I know I was harsh on that first script. This is terrific. This is exactly the way I see the show. You guys are going to stay with me. We're going to do features together. The future is nothing but bright ahead. And I said, David, I have something I have to tell you. The script that you hated was cow manure. That I wrote that script. The script that you love, Joe wrote the script. I think Joe's really the guy who shares what you want to do on the show. And there was a long silence, and he said, you'll always have a home here. And so that was the last I saw of David Swift. Anyway, those are just some random pieces of work that I did.
That's great. Did you also write for comedy albums? Did you write for Bill Dana?
Yes, when I met Bill Dana, after the material that I wrote for the guy who was doing Make Room for Daddy that he said would pass for good, I arranged a meeting with Bill Dana. It was outside a soundstage, I remember. I was so poor that I didn't really have good carbon paper. It was very hard to read. And the premise was that there were scenes from the childhood of famous people. So I would take like Jack Kennedy talking to his mother about some issue, but he would be Jack Kennedy as he sounded today. So like I would say, and he said, you got to read this because I can't read it. I say, well, these were the years when the tide came in. These were the years when we started to move. And he said, well, that's great. And so he hired me to come on to do that, and David Brinkley. And I'm not a mimic, as you may have noticed, but in point of fact, he was very enthralled by this. So we were going to be the B-side of one of his Jose Jimenez albums, which for some reason never happened. I don't remember why, but that's where I got to meet Bill and knew him over the years. And he was then going on to become the head writer on the new Steve Allen show, which is about 1961. And he said to me, I'm going to go back to Chicago. I'm going to talk to Steve. I want to tell him about you. I want to get you on the show and staff and this and that. He said, you know, don't make any deals until you hear from me. So I'm sitting at home, you know, anxious, and I read the paper, Bill Dana returns to Los Angeles. I hadn't heard from him. So I waited a few days, I called him, and I said, hi, Bill Dana. Oh, hi, how are you? I said, listen, come on over, and I want to talk to you. I said, this has got to be it, right? And I go over, and he's talking about one thing, and I said, well, you know, Sinatra wants me to open for him, but I don't want to be paid because I don't want to set a price, and he had this whole thing worked out. And finally I said, how did it go with Steve in Chicago? And he said, oh, yeah. He says, you know, if you knew how close you came to getting this job, you'd throw up right now. I didn't, but I left. And then I didn't see Bill for years after that. But Bill was a great guy, and I loved Bill. So I even got him an office out at Universal at a later date and that. So that's my Bill Dana experience.
That's great. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about Newhart. On the Newhart show, you worked with Roland Kibbe, who is a writer and producer.
Yes.
What were your first impressions of him?
Well, he was a character. He was one of the few people that was funny as a character and witty as a character at the same time. He became my best friend and collaborator for over 25 years. He's the one who bought my premises, and he's the one who took his premises and left the show. And then I got to know him socially, and then we didn't work together for many years, and then we wound up working together, and we did a number of projects like that. Kibbe was a great character. Everybody loved him. He had a terrible memory, and I could always tell when he didn't know who he was talking to because he would greet them effusively. Otherwise, he was kind of a big bear of a guy, and not surly, but not particularly warm to people. You know, hi, how are you? And somebody came by and they'd say, hi, Kibbe. He'd say, oh, hey, how are you? It's so great to see you. That's what I'm saying. He has no idea who this person is. And a woman was coming by in the commissary, and she said, so Kib, and he said, hey, how are you? Great to see you. And she says, you don't remember me. He said, of course I do. You were my secretary at Paramount in 1954. I said, Kibbe, I'm Francis Lear. And because they'd been he started Norman Lear's career. So this was sort of part of his trademark. Do you want me to go on about this guy? He's very amusing. Yeah. The great story that defined him, and I loved this guy, I mean, he was my best friend really in life at that time, was that Universal, when Marlon Brando made One-Eyed Jacks, he lost all his money. He's broke. Universal steps in, bails his company out, but he's got to do some pictures for them, and he makes some really pretty bad movies over there. One of which was The Appaloosa, starring John Saxon and Anjanette Comer. And at the very end of the film, John Saxon is pursuing him, and they're going to have a shootout at the end. That's the end of the picture. Unfortunately, at that time, Marlon Brando was being difficult, and the production shut down. So the guy who was doing the movie was his first movie because he'd been head of television at Universal. He calls Kibbe up. Kibbe had two great loves, medicine and flying. He was a flight instructor during World War II and a professional hypochondriac, which somehow worked very well for him. So he gets on a plane and he flies out to Kanab, Utah. They have a tent city where they're going to be filming this. And the producer, you got to help me. Brando won't do anything. He just hates the script. And then, so he gets together with Brando. And because Kibbe was lovable, if anything, he and Brando get along, and they start rewriting the script. They get the thing finished. He goes back to Los Angeles. He gets another call now late at night from the producer. He says, Kibbe, you got to help me. Brando's gone crazy. And he says, what is it? He said, well, we're supposed to be up in the high Sierras to shoot the finish of the picture. And he's going to kill me. I mean, he's going to ruin the picture. It's 2 in the morning, so you've got to come out here. So he said, okay, relax. So Kibbe puts on his bathrobe and gets in his car, drives out to Brando's bungalow. Brando's taking a shower or something, and he says to the producer, well, what's the problem? He says, he doesn't want to get on the plane tomorrow to go up north, and everybody's waiting. It's our last day of shooting, and he won't go. And Kibbe said, oh, Brando comes out. He's got a towel and a yellow sheet of paper with notes on it. And he said, now listen, Kibbe, it's good that you're here because I can't talk to suits. I mean, you're a creative person. He said, there's a place in Mexico. I'm not sure where it is exactly. I know they can find it. And it's got these rolling sand dunes. And I think we should shoot the fin to the finish down there. Everybody, of course, is up in the Sierras waiting for him in the morning. So Kibbe said, yeah, well, what happens? He said, well, what happens is I'm on my horse dies. And I eviscerate the horse. I bury the entrails in the sand. Then I climb inside the horse. Before he does this, he said, I walk up to the top of the next sand dune, and I walk back in my own footprints. I climb inside the horse. I pull the carcass tight. When John Saxon shows up, I come out of the horse and I shoot him in the back. This is our hero. And Kibbe says, I think that's a great idea. And his friend thinks he's been betrayed. And Brando said, well, of course, I knew if I talked to you, you're a writer, And Kibbe said, well, could you make one small change for me? And he said, well, Kibbe, you're the writer. What is it? When you go to come out of the horse and shoot John Saxon in the back, could you come out of the asshole of the horse? Kibbe and Brando took his thing through. He said, okay, let's go. And finished the picture. I don't know if this is going to make it into your documentary or not.
Oh, yeah.
But it defines him, Kibbe, who was, a really wonderful guy.
That's incredible. That's a great story. So you obviously you were talking about this. You were writing a lot of freelance scripts, and you were writing for shows like My Three Sons and Craft Suspense Theater, all these different genres. So how were you getting those jobs? Did you have an agent at the time?
I did. I signed, when I went on to the Newhart show, I signed with MCA, which was the Goliath of agencies. But there was a lawsuit from the federal government, from the Justice Department, that MCA was in violation of the Clayton and Sherman antitrust laws, which means you cannot be the buyer and the seller. They had bought Universal, they're a buyer, and they still had this great agency. So overnight, this agency went out of business. I mean, it just wasn't there the next day. They signed, the plea order, and they got out. In fact, one of the executives almost went to prison, but because MCA was very cleverly organized. Lou Wasserman, who actually ran the studio, took care of the Democrats. A guy named Taft Schreiber was the number 3 guy, took care of the Republicans and Ronald Reagan and that. So they had both things covered. And but that was it. The studio was valued at $80 million, and the agency was at $8 million, and that was the end of it. So all these agents scattered everywhere, and I stayed with one of the agents who had, helped start me, and stayed with him for a number of years.
And how did you learn to write for all those different formats?
Well, you just have to do it. You read it, and you try to figure it out. And, your producer is usually very helpful in that, because it's very difficult always, I think, to write from the outside to a show, because there's so much that goes on inside that you don't know, pros and cons and things you should do or shouldn't do. So unless you can hit them with a piece of work, and that's why when I talk to new writers, I always say, write original material. Don't try to write into their format, because there's a lot of pitfalls there. But if they can see that you're a good writer and you're writing something interesting, I think you have a much better shot of impressing them and getting a chance to work on the show.
And did any one of the genres come more easily to you than others?
Well, not really. I'm going to take that question again. The shows that I worked on initially were very diverse. One of the things that I always tried to do was to put humor in whatever it was I was doing, because as I said, I wanted to be a comedy writer. And so all of these shows had that thread to them. And then I'm bouncing around, going in and pitching shows. I got an assignment to write for a show called Maverick, but Maverick got canceled before it ever, got on the air. And then there was a show called The Man from U.N.C.L.E. And on The Man from U.N.C.L.E., the producer who created the show was a guy named Sam Roth. Sam Roth, who had also created Have Gun Will Travel, was a superior writer and a brilliant guy to devise formats for television shows. And Sam was a tough cookie. And writers were going through this show, like rabbits on the run. I mean, guys were getting cut off right and left. They were literally running out of writers, which is why they saw me, because I didn't have anything that recommended me to do this show. So I went in and I met with the story editor and had an idea. And we started talking about it, and we spent a half a day not really getting anywhere. And then Sam came in the room, and we started talking about it, and we just sort of hit it off. And all of a sudden, we're creating the story. And he sends me off to write the script, which I did, and it starred Barbara Feldon and Cesar Romero. And it had a vein of humor in it. So at that point, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. was a little more of a kind of adventure show, skewing towards younger audience. And this gave it a kind of what I like to think of as a sense of humor. So NBC saw the show and said, that's the way we want the show. So I rewrote a script. It was the very end of the season. I rewrote somebody else's script, and they came to me and they put me under contract as the sole staff writer on the show for the second year. I think I may have been the first staff writer on any drama show at that point, because they were all done by freelance writers, So I was on the show for, I don't know, I did like 12 or 13 episodes. I got so that I could write a story in a week, do the script in 2 weeks, work with the director for a week, and then start over again like that. And I did a lot of them. And I sort of had a handle on the show, so it came easy to me. And in those days also, because I don't want to sound too heroic, is that there was so much television. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of television now, but there's 6 episodes here and 4 episodes. When I started, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. was 39 episodes. So they're going through a lot of writers. There's a lot of work out there. I suspect there was probably more work then than there is now. Although there's a lot now, but the series would go on for great distances. So anybody who could string 10 words together was going to get a shot. Somebody was going to read you. So that's how I got onto The Man from U.N.C.L.E.
And was there some kind of directive that was given to the writers, or a kind of Bible for what an episode was supposed to be like?
No, not really. At that point, Sam left the show because he had a fight with the studio. And so I was the only guy, and I just considered that I had the Holy Grail. I was the one who knew the show. Nobody else really kind of understood it. So people would turn to me and ask me, should it be like this or like that? And I'm saying, well, try that. I don't really know. I just knew that I had a facility for writing that show. And from a career standpoint, it's like somebody turned on the lights, because I used to go into pitch for hour shows, and I'd be the room of 8 guys, and I'm the 8th guy who gets called in. Now, after this show, I walk in, and I'm called in right away, because they want to talk to me.
Hello?
Oh,
Hi.
I think we have to cut.